Okay, we are live. So let's start the show. Hello, my name is Joseph Aleo, and you're listening to Mage the podcast. This is the show where we talk about all things Mage related, of course. And on today's show, I'm very excited. Our guest is going to be Carrie Kube. She's the author of the Babel Center, and it's available on the Storytellers Vault. Carrie, thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you very much.
And I want to thank you for sending me the game book. Is this the first game book you've designed?
Actually, no. The first game book I designed was for Vampire the Masquerade called Bloodlinebook Deava. I've also done some fan-related stuff for Ravenloft like over 10 years ago.
All right. Well, all right. So you have some background about this, and I'm very curious to get to that. But first of all, give us the elevator pitch. Why should we buy the Babel Center?
It's a how do I put it? I'm sorry, I kind of got a little. The pitch is, what if a mystical werewolf artifact had gotten into the hands of somebody who probably doesn't deserve to have it, in this case the technocracy. It follows the story of year-long game. I'm sorry, I'm just a little.
Don't get flustered. Well, okay, let's back up a little bit. Because I, of course, know about Werewolf, but I've never really played it. So tell us a bit about this artifact.
The Babel Center was when I read it in Hammer and Enclave, which is a artifact book for Werewolf the Apocalypse. The first thought that came to my mind is, what if? Imagine how interesting it'd be if another group got their hands on it, especially one that you would least suspect, like the technocracy. What the artifact does, it can spy on various places, it can teleport you to different areas, and plus it's also haunted, which you can with various spirits and such.
So it's ripe for a lot of crossover for different World of Darkness games.
Yes, it is.
All right. So all right. Now that we have a little bit of background, uh, when you initially designed this, did you have to contact the people at White Wolf and say, "I want to do this little crossover thing," or did you just go for it and there wasn't any restrictions or anything like that?
Well, from what I've read, I tried to keep it mostly mage centered. The werewolf stuff is more of a side thing. You can even play it without werewolves.
Ah, I did not know that. So, what was the appeal about introducing this artifact to Mage and specifically for the technocracy?
Well, it was just an idea that popped into my head, as I said before, that as I thought this would be an interesting artifact for the mages, or even more interestingly, the technocracy, since it's something that they normally wouldn't consider at first, and then once, but just imagine all those angry werewolves, and if they find out a servant of the Weaver has pretty much got their hands on something they thought they destroyed.
Now, the other thing I find there's two things I find interesting about this setup is one, you've got a rich cast of characters, which I think we should go into, and two, if you choose to, this game unfolds over a number of years. I think 7 years to be exact. Is that right?
Yep.
All right, so let's talk about the cast of characters because you really fleshed them out. In fact, half the book is dedicated to giving the backstory about the characters. So let's introduce them one by one, and let's start off with we'll call her our protagonist.
You mean Molly, right?
Of course, yes, Molly.
What Molly was sort of loosely, how do I put it? I'm sorry. I'm sure this is probably not too exciting for your listeners to have a host that's just a little nervous and
Oh,
what
nothing to
exactly
worry about. We're a nerd community, so I don't
yeah.
see any problem.
What exactly would you
Well,
like me to mention about Molly?
Well, each of these characters have their own motivations and their own desires and their own shortcomings. And so, what I thought we'd do is explain why these five characters are important to uh, your story. And then, after we flesh that out, we could go into the fact that it takes place over the course of 7 years. And you've modified the game that you can play it for Mage First Edition, Second Edition, and you can even, if you choose to, do a crossover for, say, something like um, the name escapes me, the Ghost game,
Rate.
Rapes. Thank you, Rape. So all I'm really trying to do is give the listener some context. And like I said, the five characters, they figure heavily, they're very important to the storyline. They sort of really direct the way the story should be shaped and told, and how the characters would interact with those your characters that you've created. So let's talk about Molly first.
Well, Molly is a, sort of the outcast among the technocracy. If she kind of thinks she's not all that useful or important because she just kind of keeps screwing up, but she eventually finds her destiny as something that is beyond the technocracy, which makes her both an asset but a huge risk because she's, I guess you could say she's a bit of a wrong thinker in a way.
The other thing I found that's interesting about Molly is after a while she can only be separated from the Wonder, which is what this device is called, uh, for only short periods of time. And as she progresses, she can stay away from it longer. But it's almost like an addiction for her, or a safe place for her.
Exactly, because the Babel Center is the one thing that truly understands her. I mean, the other members of the five, which is what they call their group, they kind of they do understand and care about her, but not as much as the center does.
So this is your story. Why does the Babel Center care so much about Molly?
Well, if you take one of the enlightened possibilities, that's kind of like a what if scenario. You can use it or not. I was inspired by what Ravenloft did by having dread possibilities that could be used in your game. And spoiler, there's a thing that the Babel Center is looking for, which is a mate, which can help leash it to its full potential. And if you choose to use the enlightened possibility, Molly is that mate.
I thought that was a really nice touch, and you kind of buried it midway through the book, and I was like, "Oh, well, of course, that makes sense. It's right a revelation." But there's a little bit of misdirect because the five think that their task is to build the mate, but the mate is Molly.
Yep.
So let's talk about the rest of the five. We have Derek Summers. Tell us about Derek.
Well, the funny thing was Derek was originally based off a Phoenix Wright character who kind of made these low common denominator shows. And so I kind of used that as a character, and then Derek grew from that. Much like Molly, he's also kind of an outcast because he sort of has some beliefs and theories that would kind of put him at odds with the technocracy. Plus, he's still got a certain little flaw that where his genius would rather be an avatar, as you noticed in the stats.
So what is his outlook that would put him at odds with the technocracy? We talked about Molly and the fact that Molly seems like a wrong thinker. So what's Derek Summers' line of thinking?
Well, he believes that dreams have possibility. He does think that there's, how do I put it? Yeah. Also, I think he does think that the technocracy does is a little bit of a, they could be more open minded to some things. And he's
I
taking
really
a sorry,
no.
go
Go
ahead.
ahead. No, no, you go ahead.
Yeah, he's probably taking some of the biggest risks because of such as trusting such a wonder like the that's so spiritually heavy. And
Well, one of the reasons I like these characters is that it does not paint the technocracy as being black and white. There's a lot of room for nuance, and that
Hmm.
each person can have their own motivations. And just because they're part of the organization doesn't mean they're marching along in lockstep.
Right.
And so I really enjoyed that. So let's move on to, and I'm not sure I can pronounce this right,
Gian.
Gian. So tell us about Gian Lawler.
Oh, a little fun fact, his name is actually a combination of two contestants from the show Ink Master, because I was watching the show while coming up with his name.
Oh, that's a nice little tidbit. All right, so tell us about Gian.
Gian is a man in love. At first, he's doing this well because it's what the technocracy would want him to do, is to look into this. But he's also a man in love, and he sees the good that it's doing for Leah, but the but eventually but he also eventually sees the good it can do, and not just for her.
Well, that was another interesting development. Is if you go through this game through the course of the 7 years, um, this relationship of theirs has its crest and valleys. And at
Hmm.
one point, he's trying to win her back, and then he does indeed get her back. And spoilers, she's pregnant towards the end, if I recall correctly.
Yes.
And so I thought that was a real nice touch. So I guess we should jump to Leah then. So tell us about Leah Stone.
Well, she was originally a playgirl, a bon vivant, but after a little accident involving the Avatar storm, she pretty much lost everything. Her father, her one of her biggest works, several of her boy toys, and nearly had her genius ripped out of her body. So she's kind of a very weakened state. But thankfully, Gian is there for her. But as she learns more about the Babel Center, she starts getting a second wind again.
So all these characters, they're changed by their encounter with the Babel Center. And it doesn't just happen overnight, it happens over time.
Right. Same with Malcolm, the fifth and final one.
All right, so let's move to Malcolm then. Tell us about Malcolm. What's his personality like, and what's his motivations and his concerns?
Well, Malcolm is kind of a he's a smart kid, he's talented, but he also has a bit of an ego because he comes from such a prestigious line of void engineers. So he can be very proud, and he at first he isn't all that nice to Molly because he thinks she's just some doof that only in there because people felt sorry for her. But as he gets to know the Babel Center, his sense of adventure is ignited, and eventually Molly starts earning his respect, and he does get learn some lessons, especially during one of the later years when a little accident robs him of his legs.
So what's really interesting is in a lot of ways this does read like a book because these characters, they have their own goals, they have their strengths, they have their weaknesses, and it unfolds over a time of 7 years. How did these characters come to you, and why five? It could have been three, could have been seven, but why these five characters in particular?
Well, I thought it would be practical to have one from each of the conventions.
That makes sense, yes.
And Derek I had in mind for a while, and then the the others just came to me.
Is there one that you are particularly fond of? I mean, if I had to guess, I'd say Molly, but I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Oh, I like them all. Molly does hold a place, but I, I think I do like them all equally.
So, as I said, the other thing that I find that's really enchanting about this game is that it does take place over the course of 7 years. So, I think what we need to do is explain how the player's characters might interact with the five, And why did you decide to have this game unfold over 7 years? And I have to assume, of course, that it doesn't necessarily have to take place over 7 years in game time. That if you chose to, you could insert the characters in any particular year. But let's go back. What's the introduction to the five for the player characters, and why did you choose to have the story unfolded within 7 years?
Well, when I was planning it out, it naturally did that. And basically, there's options where you can have the characters meet the five before they become a group, and just kind of have an adventure too, where you might contact them, then bring the Babel Center in. As I said before, the 7 years just came to me as I was writing more and more of it. That's what I find kind of happens when I write things, is things don't always come out as planned.
Well, that is the magical thing about writing, for sure. Although I've never really written anything as fleshed out for a game as this. I usually have a rough sketch, but this is really, really thorough. Now, you said this is not the first game that you have written for the Storytellers Vault, that there was a vampire game. So what did you learn from that experience that you applied to the
Well,
Babel
one
Center?
one thing is, don't be your own editor, otherwise you're going to get mistakes.
So who did you use as an editor? Did you use Onyx or White Wolf, or did you have someone else to help you out?
Well, for this one, I had my sister read through it. You see, I kind of like to have an unbiased point of view, and my sister has never played a role playing game in her life. So basically, that unbiased point of view does help out. She goes
That's
over.
Go
Oh,
ahead.
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that's fascinating. Since she doesn't have any background in role playing games whatsoever, what did she make of this?
She really liked the imagination I put into the story, and I always provide her with a side sheet telling her what exactly certain things are.
So after
And,
she read through it, did she have any desire to possibly want to play a role playing game, maybe the Babel Center?
well, she's very busy. I did have a second person look through it who was more of a mage player, so I could get the stats right.
Well, that helps. Now, you were about to say something about your sister helping you out editing before I interrupted you. Do you happen to recall what you were about to say?
No, not at the moment.
Okay, so one of the things that you advise for people who, if they want to write their own game book, is to have an editor besides themselves. What else have you learned from this experience?
Well, one thing I've learned is, if you're going to be interviewed, don't be so nervous.
No, it's okay to be nervous. I don't think most people really have an opportunity to talk about something that they're passionate about. And but like I said, we're a nerd community. We're pretty forgiving people.
Yep. And the other thing well, this is the first adventure I wrote. One thing I learned is that you gotta make sure the players are not just the sidekicks. That's why I included an option of, just in case one of the five dies. That way they won't have such heavy plot armor, and you're just not sitting there to watch everything.
I like that for two reasons. One, for that reason specifically, and also because it also introduces that element of risk. Like, holy crap, one of the five could die. What else could happen? Um,
Hmm.
well, the other thing I want to go back to is that the fact that you set this game up deliberately, that you could set up for various editions of Mage or other crossovers. So, what did you have to do to tailor this game to those particular editions?
Well, I had to read up a little on what those editions were like, because I'm not too familiar with first edition. And I also wanted to make it a what if scenario about if you want to just play mages, and there's a possibility of getting Molly on your side, and quite possibly Derek, although that's a lot harder, and just totally change the face of the game.
So, why? Mage, you've written for Vampire, you've done some stuff for Ravenloft. What got you to role playing games in the first place, and how did this all lead to World of Darkness and Mage specifically?
Well, I first got interested in role playing games when I played the card game Spellfire, and I
Never
wanted
heard
to
of that
learn.
one.
Oh, it's kind of like Magic the Gathering. It was around in the 90s. They used art from old D&D books.
So, who got you involved in that? Was it just natural curiosity, or did someone have a deck of
Natural
cards?
curiosity. And then when I started reading more about the stories behind the characters, I that's what got me interested in tabletop, and then it grew more and more from there.
So, when you play role playing games, are you more of a game master or are you a player character?
I've done both actually.
Do you have a preference?
Depends on the setting. I'd like
All right,
to.
go ahead.
It's one that I haven't played before. I'll be a player character first. But if it's one I'm more familiar with, I'd like to at least try to DM eventually.
Do you have a particular style of being a dungeon master or game master that you that seems to be consistent no matter what game you play?
Well, I developed this little tactic where after the game I'll ask the players in character what they think of a certain character. For example, one group of players said, "Well, I think this character is all talk and no action." So I secretly had that all talk and no action character start performing more action subtly while
Mm,
still keeping up the illusion that he doesn't, they still all talk.
I like that idea. I'm definitely gonna have to incorporate that myself. All right, so let's go back to this card game. So that was your introduction to games. Did that go directly to Dungeons and Dragons, or what led you to the dark path of role playing games?
Well, the Ravenloft cards for Spellfire were especially interesting, and I liked the stories behind them. Ravenloft is kind of like what if Edgar Allan Poe was allowed to create his own D&D world.
That's a good description.
So eventually I started collecting books from that. I played some D&D, and then eventually I learned about other gaming systems, especially World of Darkness, and it grew from there.
So, what was your first experience like playing a role playing game? What did you think? I mean, obviously you liked it because here we are talking about it. But what was your first experience like?
Well, it was fun. Basically, we I was at a convention. We were trying out 3.5 out just to for play tests. And my character had the idea, instead of just giving a ransom to the people we could just, in food, why don't we just cast an illusion over a bunch of sticks and
Oh,
pretend
that's
that's the wheat
clever.
harvest? And the
I
guy
love it.
said,
Wait,
"Well, you should do advanced D&D." And I just mentioned, "Thanks."
wait a minute. So, your first time role playing was at a convention?
Yeah,
Well, that's going off the deep end. That must have been. I think I'd be a little nervous.
it wasn't so bad. Everybody was friendly and such.
Well, there I go back to the nerd love thing again. All right, so start off with a deck of cards, get you into Dungeons and Dragons. How does this take us to World of Darkness, and more specifically, how does this lead to Mage?
Well, I remember looking through catalogs of different stuff, and because I used to live near a gaming shop before it closed down, and and I saw one of the books for sale there, and it was a werewolf player's guide. And through that I learned about the other ones.
Do you have a
And
preference amongst the World of Darkness line?
well, I'd say I'm the most familiar with Vampire the Masquerade, since that's the one that's most well known and most available.
Right. But why Mage then?
Well, as I said before, I thought it would be fun to try to make a mage book because for some reason the idea popped in my head. What if this artifact got into the hands of the technocracy?
So now that you've written this game book, do you have any other ideas for other game books you'd like to submit to the Storytellers Vault?
Well, I as soon as the guy who's doing the layout for my Modern Cappadocians game book, I'll be publishing that. But I there's is I one project I'd like to do is a friend and foe book for Mage.
Oh, that could be fun. So, what's the attraction to that particular setup?
The friend and foe.
Yes.
Well, I've done a antagonist book for vampire, but this one will be for mage, of course. I just had all these ideas for various different characters, and I just wanted to finally make a book for them.
Well, I would love to have you back on the show to talk about Friends and Foe. When do you think it might be published?
Oh, it'll be quite a while. I
All
just got to
right.
get the.
Go ahead. Sorry. I don't
Oh,
mean to
I
interrupt
just.
you.
Oh, that's okay. I might work on some other ga- gaming books from other worlds as well first.
All right, I understand. Hey, before we wrap this up, I am curious because it's a new world out there. I've been away from role playing games for a couple decades, but a lot of people are doing it online through Roll20 or they'll do it through Skype. When you play role playing games, are you doing it online or are you doing it face to face in front of people over a table?
While I prefer face to face. I think I'm going to start doing more Skype plays because it's just hard to find people to play with these days.
I know what you mean. I've been part of a Vampire Chronicle for like the last year and a half, but as of next year, the guy's moving away. I'm like, well, I don't know what we're going to do at that point. I mean, I guess I can step up the plate and do a game myself, but we'll be losing two essential people. So I myself have been looking to do games online as well. But I would rather just do it face to face with friends. It's a lot more fun.
Okay.
So before we go, I wanted to give you the opportunity to talk about anything else that's on your mind, or if there's anything else that we did not cover about the Babel Center that you think we should touch on.
Oh no, you don't have any more questions?
No, believe it or not, we are at the half-hour mark.
Okay. Well, it was a pleasure talking to you.
Well, it's been great fun. So before we go, I just want to tell the listeners that if you enjoy this show, you can find us online at magethepodcast.com. And we've been doing the show for, oh, I guess it's been close to a year, maybe a little less than a year. And if you go to magethepodcast.com, you can listen to all the other episodes. There's 26 of them. And also we have a new co-host. His name is Terry Robinson, and you will be hearing him. Well, actually, he was on last week's show. And so it's a welcome addition because when I started the show, there wasn't really a lot of podcasts for Mage. In fact, there was one other that was an actual play podcast and thought, well, they have shows for Werewolf and they have shows for Vampire. Why not Mage? And but I didn't want it to be all about me. I wanted other people who are way more knowledgeable, and I got lucky with Adam Simpson, and I got doubly lucky with Terry Robinson. So he's a welcome addition to the team. If you want to follow us on Twitter, you can follow us at Mage the Podcast, and you can subscribe to Mage the Podcast at iTunes, Google Play, and the TuneIn app. So obviously you're listening to the show, so maybe you're listening to the browser, maybe you're listening to a podcast app. There's a myriad of ways to listen to the show. And from Mage the Podcast and Carrie Kube, I'm Joseph Leo. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week.